The Union of 1707, the historical context. The events, the true timeline that the government of the United Kingdom stole and enslaved Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England, and put them into slavery. Anglo-Scottish relations before 1689. From 1603 Scotland and England were joined in a loose union known as the Union of the Crowns, under which they shared a monarch. The death of Elizabeth I of England without heirs meant that the English Tudor dynasty came to an end. Her nearest relatives, as members of the Stuart dynasty of Scotland, assumed the thrones of England and Ireland as well. Under the Union of the Crowns, Scotland and England maintained separate parliaments and privy councils. The privy councils operated as the representatives and advisors of the monarch, and acted as a form of executive power, which was particularly important in the Scottish context where the monarch was rarely present. By the later 17th century, a number of disadvantages of this arrangement had come to strongly manifest themselves, from the Scottish point of view. As the largest and most powerful of the three kingdoms, England would always command the bulk of the monarch's attention, to the neglect of Scotland and Ireland. As the monarch controlled foreign policy, he would determine when Scotland and England went to war, but would make these decisions based on the interests of England. When England made war on the Dutch Republic 3 times between the 1650s and the 1670s, the decision ignored the fact that the Dutch were a major trading partner of Scotland. And while Scotland might have to participate in wars against England's rivals, Scotland was excluded from the commercial benefits of the developing English Empire, as the Navigation Acts, passed in the second half of the 17th century, stipulated that England's colonies in North America and the West Indies could only trade with England, to the exclusion of the Scots and the Irish. The dynastic issue. The Revolution of 1688 offered an opportunity for those Scots who were dissatisfied with this arrangement to imagine change. The Union of the Crowns had been a dynastic accident, and would persist only as long as the Stuart dynasty. In 1688, this dynasty was ruptured by a revolution that affected the kingdoms of Scotland, England, and Ireland. James VII of Scotland, James II of England and Ireland, was deposed from the throne as his Catholic faith had made his position untenable. His infant son, who would be brought up as a Catholic, would be excluded from the line of succession by the English Parliament on the same grounds. Those who supported the Catholic Stuarts as the true line of succession became known as Jacobites, and would be a thorn in the side of the British Protestant establishment for decades to come. The English Parliament therefore decided that James's Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne, would be next in line to the throne. But as they were both childless, and likely to remain so, it seemed likely that the Protestant Stuart line would fail. In 1701, the English Parliament decided that if or when this eventuality came about, the English throne would pass over any Catholic claimants and come to rest with the Protestant House of Hanover, from Germany. But the English Parliament could only make this decision on behalf of England and Ireland. Would Scotland choose to adopt the same line of succession? The Revolution of 1688 and its aftermath, therefore offered an opportunity to those Scots who wanted a better deal from Scotland's relationship with England. The troubles of the 1690s. In the years between 1689 and 1707 the Scottish Parliament was in a bullish mood, keen to demonstrate its separateness from England. This stemmed from a number of events and challenges of the 1690s, during the reign of Mary, as the eldest daughter of James VII and II, and her husband William. Firstly, a decision was taken after the Revolution to restore the Presbyterian Church as the established Church of Scotland. Whereas before, bishops had sat in the Scottish Parliament, and had been reliable supporters of the Crown, the Presbyterian Church had no bishops, and therefore one channel that the Crown had formerly used to influence Parliament, was lost. Secondly, the massacre of Glencoe of 1692 was a public relations disaster for the Crown. The massacre was intended to make an example of a clan that had been slow to swear allegiance to William and Mary, and was thus an anti-Jacobite measure. However, it emerged that the orders to carry it out had come from the highest level, from the Lord Advocate, Dalrymple of Stair, and it therefore harmed the reputation of William and Mary's rule. Thirdly, the Scottish economy was in desperate straits in the 1690s. Severe famine struck in 4 years of that decade. In addition, from 1695 a Scottish plan to acquire a colony, at Darien on the Isthmus of Panama, captured the imagination of the Scottish people and attracted massive investment. When the scheme failed, Scotland was left sorely lacking in capital, and with her national self-esteem severely battered. It was alleged that William, acting in the interests of England, had sabotaged Scotland's endeavour. On the other hand, some questioned whether Scotland could survive as a small kingdom in a Europe dominated by large states and empires. Negotiations for union. In 1701, the English Parliament passed the Act of Settlement, which stipulated that in the event of the death of Anne, the last remaining Protestant heir of James VII and II, England would implement the Hanoverian succession. In the years that followed, Scotland could play upon England's fear of the Jacobite threat. In the English imagination, there could be no greater threat than that Scotland might welcome back the Catholic Stuart line, and reforge her ancient alliance with France. Such an arrangement would leave England sandwiched between a hostile Scotland to the north, and a hostile France across the Channel. The session of the Scottish Parliament that met in 1703-4 passed two provocative acts that fed these fears. The Act of Security stated that Scotland was not bound to support England's choice of a successor to Queen Anne. And the Act to End Peace and War stated that following the death of Queen Anne, Scotland would retake control of her own foreign policy, thus refusing to be dragged into wars based on English interests. Scotland was threatening to walk away from the Union of the Crowns, to reassert her independence. If this was blackmail, then England responded in kind. The Alien Act of 1705, passed by the English Parliament, stipulated that unless negotiations for union were underway by Christmas of that year, then Scots would be considered as aliens in England, that is, they would be prevented from trading with or in England. England's threat worked, and representatives of the Scottish Parliament were ready to negotiate for a union. The negotiations proceeded with relative smoothness. By January 1707 the Scottish Parliament had voted itself out of existence, and the Union came into effect on the 1st of May, 1707. Westminster passes the Alien Act 1705. At Westminster on the 29th of November, 1704, Lord Godolphin, the Lord High Treasurer, explained to the House of Lords why Queen Anne had approved the Scottish Act of Security, which preserved the Kirk, trade and the gains of the 1688 Revolution in Scotland. He said the Act contained some undesirable elements, but it was essential that any Scottish threat to England's safety should be neutralised. Economic pressure. The Tories wanted to censure Godolphin for allowing the Act to pass, but the Whigs said that would antagonise the Scots even more by implying that their legislature was inferior to the English. It was far better, they said, to bring union upon the Scots through economic pressure. Over the next few days Godolphin was deep in negotiations with the dominant group of Whigs, known as the Junto Whigs, in the English House of Lords, the first step towards the conclusive negotiations of 1706. Two new bills. When the Lords resumed their deliberations on Scotland on the 6th of December, two bills were proposed by Lord Somers, one of the Junto leaders, with Godolphin's support. One offered fresh negotiations for a full incorporating union, with a single parliament and unified free trade area. The other, an Aliens Bill, threatened that unless Scotland agreed to negotiate terms for union and accepted the Hanoverian succession by the 25th of December, 1705, there would be a ban on the import of all Scottish staple products into England. Scots would also lose the privileges of Englishmen under English law, thus endangering rights to any property they held in England. Both bills became law early in 1705. Act of Security 1704. The Act of Security 1704, also referred to as the Act for the Security of the Kingdom, was a response by the Parliament of Scotland to the Parliament of England's Act of Settlement 1701. Queen Anne's last surviving child, William, Duke of Gloucester, had died in 1700, and both parliaments needed to find a Protestant successor. The English Parliament had settled on Electress Sophia of Hanover, granddaughter of King James VI and I, without consulting the Scottish Parliament. The response of the Scottish Parliament was to pass a bill in 1703-1, requiring that, on the death of Queen Anne without issue, the three estates of the Parliament were to appoint a Protestant successor from the descendants of the Scottish kings, but not the English successor unless various economic, political and religious conditions were met. The bill was refused royal assent by the Lord High Commissioner to the Parliament of Scotland. The following year, 1704, the bill became an act after the Scottish Parliament refused to raise taxes, and sought to withdraw troops from the Duke of Marlborough's army in the War of the Spanish Succession unless royal assent was given. The English Parliament retaliated with the Alien Act 1705, 2, threatening to cut trade and free movement between the two countries, 1, unless negotiations opened leading either to the repeal of the Act of Security, or, as in the event happened, to an Act of Union. The result was the Union of England and Scotland into the Kingdom of Great Britain in 1707, approximately 100 years after the Union of the Crowns. The Parliament of Great Britain passed an Act, repeal of certain Scotch Acts 1707, 6 and c. 32, explicitly repealing this Act together with the Act to end peace and war. The Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies, also called the Scottish Darien Company, was an overseas trading company created by an Act of the Parliament of Scotland in 1695. The Act granted the company a monopoly of Scottish trade to India, Africa, and the Americas, extraordinary sovereign rights and 21 years of exemptions from taxation. All told, the venture, dubbed the Darien Scheme, drained Scotland of an estimated quarter of its liquid assets, and played a key role in forcing the country to the 1707 Act of Union, which united the kingdoms of Scotland and England. By 1707, the company's debt was over £14,000, equivalent to £2,506,110 in 2021. The new joint government, in a political bargain, agreed to cover the costs of winding up the Company of Scotland, in addition to compensate for servicing the English national debt and higher taxes for Scotland. Equivalent Act 1713. The equivalent was a sum negotiated at £398,085 0d. Equivalent to £71,260,439 in 2021, paid to Scotland by the English government under the terms of the Acts of Union 1707. Proposals for it first emerged in the course of abortive Union negotiations in 1702 to 1703. The equivalent's purposes were ostensibly to take account of the contribution that Scots taxpayers would then make towards servicing the English national debt and as transitional mitigation of the effects of higher taxes on the Scottish economy. Though attempts have been made to see it as a precise calculation, it is now generally regarded as part of a political bargain designed for other purposes as well, such as the costs of winding up the Company of Scotland, which had undertaken the Darien Scheme. Shareholders in and creditors of the company were to receive 58.6% of the equivalent. It was also suggested that payments found their way to members of the Scottish Parliament who voted for its abolition. The fund was ultimately overseen in 1728 by Patrick Campbell, Lord Monsey, a Scottish judge. The treaty. So what did the Union consist of? Article 2 emphasised the issue that had been England's concern all along. Scotland would accept the Hanoverian succession after the death of Queen Anne, thus ensuring that Great Britain remained committed to Protestant monarchy, and opposition to the Jacobite threat. Article 4 is suggestive of what Scotland had to gain from the Union. It stipulated that all subjects of the new Great Britain were to enjoy the same rights, including rights to trade with the colonies that had been English but were now British. Of the 25 articles, most were concerned with trade and taxation, in easing Scotland into a new fiscal system through tax breaks. These might suggest that the Union negotiations had been hard fought, with valuable concessions gained by the Scottish representatives. On the other hand, it has long been alleged that the Union was accomplished by the bribing of Scottish MPs to secure their votes. Article 15 provided Scotland with a significant sum of money, nearly £400,000, known as the equivalent, which was ostensibly to compensate Scotland for her adoption of England's national debt. This is one of the longest and most complicated of the articles, and with good reason. Once the jargon is stripped away, it becomes evident that a significant portion of this money was to be paid to shareholders in the Company of Scotland, the company that had overseen the failed scheme to build a colony in Darien. As many of the investors in this scheme were also members of the Scottish Parliament, they were being offered the chance to get their money back if they supported the Union. There are many other examples of what might be seen as bribery greasing the passage of the Union, from the payment of salary arrears to the plum jobs and pensions that were distributed afterwards. However, the key question that must be debated is whether bribery changed people's minds, or merely shored up the support of those who would have voted for Union anyway. Changing perspectives. In the later decades of the 20th century, and possibly in connection with the resurgence of Scottish nationalism, the prevailing orthodoxy held that the Union was a dirty deal, made possible by the bribes paid to unprincipled politicians, while public opinion out of doors protested against the loss of Scottish independence. In recent years, however, and stimulated particularly by the 300th anniversary of the Union in 2007, new research has challenged this view and opened further channels for investigation. The importance of religion and principle? Recent research has challenged the thesis that the Union was made by bribery and the self-interest of the Scottish political class. Instead, greater weight is being given to the factors of religion and even principle. Put simply, the Presbyterian Church that was restored in Scotland following the Revolution of 1688 was a staunchly Protestant one, and adherents of this faith therefore had a compelling reason to view union with England as the best defence against the related threats of Jacobitism and the power of Catholic France. It thus seems likely that many of those who voted for the Union were doing so out of self-interest, but were also doing what they believed was best for their country and their Protestant faith. What about England? Until recently, the Union of 1707 has been studied largely as an event in Scottish history, to the neglect of its English and British dimensions. Historians had been too slow to ask the same questions of English politicians connected to the Union as they had of Scottish politicians. What were their allegiances, their interests, their career paths, their family connections? However, new research is throwing greater light on the English side of the Union, particularly in terms of considering the presence of Jacobite sentiment in England, possibly at the highest social and political levels, and in considering the greater interests of England and later Britain in terms of ongoing war with France and the expansion of empire. What kind of union? The union that took place in 1707 was an incorporating union, wherein the Scottish and English parliaments ceased to exist and were replaced by the new Parliament of Great Britain. However, historians are increasingly coming to emphasize that the implementation of such a union was far from inevitable, and that many possible forms of union were discussed and debated, both in the public sphere and at the highest political levels. In particular, the notion of a looser, confederal union was a significant contender. By considering the different types of union that were debated, historians are better able to situate Anglo-Scottish relations in a broader European context, in comparison with other unions such as in Spain or Poland-Lithuania. The birth of government of the United Kingdom, His Majesty's government, or, when the reigning monarch is female, Her Majesty's government, abbreviated to HM government, and commonly known as the government of the United Kingdom, British government or UK government, is the central executive authority of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. William Seaton of Pittenden. At first glance he might appear typical of the slippery and unprincipled politics that has been seen as a shaping force upon the Union. His background led some to suspect him of holding Jacobite sympathies, while the fact that enjoyed advancement as a consequence of his vociferous support for the Union might lead to the conclusion that he pursued his own interests at the expense of those of his country. However, Seaton's rhetoric, in his speeches to the Scottish Parliament, bears deeper examination, and reveals him to have been deeply concerned with the welfare of Scotland. In his mind, neither the union of the crowns nor the Jacobite alternative could secure the peace and prosperity of the Scottish people. Only union with England could accomplish these hopes. Andrew Fletcher of Saltown. In a similar vein, to take Andrew Fletcher of Saltown at first glance would be to encounter a celebrated patriot, whose opposition to the Union shaped his popular reputation in his own time, and has made him an icon of Scottish nationalism to this day. Again, however, Fletcher is a figure who demands greater investigation. While his speeches, and the pamphlets he published in the years before the Union opposed the proposals that were emerging from the negotiations, Fletcher's ideas were much more than a sentimental defence of Scottish independence. In truth, he was more deeply concerned with good government than with national identity, and he saw in the years 1703 to 1707 an opportunity for Scotland to demand more effective government, through the reform of the Union of the Crowns. By proposing limitations that would guarantee certain Scottish rights, therefore, Fletcher was an opponent of the incorporating union that eventually did take place, but a supporter of a different, looser kind of union between Scotland and England. Times the Coronation Oath Act 1688, 1 will. And March c. 6 is an Act of the Parliament of England. It was passed in 1689. the preamble noted that, by the law and ancient usage of this realm, the monarchs of England had taken a solemn oath at their coronation to maintain the statute, laws, and customs of the country and of its inhabitants. But the text of this oath had become partly meaningless over time, framed in doubtful words and expressions with relation to ancient laws and constitutions at this time unknown. 3. It established a single uniform oath to be taken by future monarchs at their coronation, and also established that this oath was to be taken by William III and Mary II when they were crowned. The oath was fundamentally different from the traditional coronation oath, which recognized laws as being the grant of the king, whereas the Act's oath sought to bind the king to rule according to the law agreed in Parliament. 4. At the forefront of the oath, then, is the distillation of the core principle of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, namely an assertion of the constitutional supremacy of Parliament, a principle that remains the basis of public law in the United Kingdom. 5. By delaying his coronation for 8 months after assuming his kingship, Charles III thus delayed the taking of the oath and its public commitments. However, this did not affect his formal legal powers, e.g. to assent to legislation from the moment he acceded to the crown. 6. The oath was shorter than the one used in 1688-89, removing a number of awkward phrases and references to past monarchs. A significant alteration was the explicit inclusion of an oath to maintain the true profession of the gospel and the Protestant Reformed religion established by law, rather than the somewhat more vague promise to protect and defend the bishops and churches under mighty government. So it is very clear in 1707 Parliament ceased to exist, and in its place was the government of the United Kingdom. The union that took place in 1707 was an incorporating union, wherein the Scottish and English Parliaments ceased to exist, and were replaced by the new Parliament of United Kingdom. 1688-89 William and Mary Coronation Oath, form of oath and administration thereof. The Archbishop or Bishop shall say, "Will you solemnly promise, and swear to govern the people of this kingdom of England and the dominions thereto belonging according to the statutes in Parliament, agreed on and the laws and customs of the same?" The King and Queen shall say, "I solemnly promise so to do." Every coronation oath since then has removed thereto belonging according to the statutes in Parliament agreed on and the laws and customs of the same. So it is very clear that His Majesty's government have no legal authority from any king or queen, which means treason and slavery and democide. Which means no act or statute since 1688-89 are lawful to our Constitution of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. Wake up, people. Democide, the murder of any person or people by a government, including genocide, politicide, and mass murder. How is this true? Just look at history. We have never been out of war since the First World War. The bank found both sides, just like the fund Big Pharma and United Nations, World Economic Forum, World Health Organization, and many more industries. This is a real war on the people by foreign governments that do not answer to anyone or be held accountable in law. There is a reason for this. This only applies to a person. It is illegal to use the legal name. The truth will set you free.